Executive Director of the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, and for more than 17 years has dedicated herself to the human rights of women, to social development and community-based development, and to the building of partnerships for change between multiple constituencies. For 5 minutes to Nalini.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. 2 years into Agenda 2030, we see our governments, as also outlined by the panelists, setting legal amendments and institutional frameworks that attempt to tie the development agenda to human rights conventions with the aim of eliminating discrimination against women. While the Jordan and Uganda presentations have outlined remarkable efforts on laws and policies, 2 years is still too early to map out the full progress. Structural changes take time, and siloed approaches to achieving gender equality does not work. Both the thematic and national reviews indicate that states are inclined to maintain business as usual or even deepen the systemic inequalities in order to gain international comparative advantage. This approach is why we see 8 men owning the same amount of wealth as half of the world's population, and that much of the SDGs indicators are not able to be addressed. And since the color of the day is orange, and we are talking about structural barriers, I would like to focus on some key structural barriers. First, in recent years, the world has experienced a resurgence of authoritarian, patriarchal governance propagating the notions that countries need strong, aggressive leadership. The consequence is diminished participatory democracy with a higher tolerance for sexism, racism, discrimination, shrinking of democratic space, and increased political repression, and increased attacks on women's human rights defenders. And if I have to pick one indicator that we are well aware of, that would be the percentage of women in parliaments, which remains low globally at 23.3%, and in my sub-region, the Pacific, remains at 7.5%, with Fiji at 14%, Papua New Guinea at 2%, and Vanuatu at 0%. Second, patriarchal and authoritarian governance often leads to increased militarism, and there are ongoing conflicts, territorial disputes, and build-up in military threats in Asia-Pacific. There is always a threat of reverting to military rule in countries which have had a history of military interventions, and we know that militarism directs much needed state resources away from social spending and what might be better spent on sustainable development initiatives. Third, neoliberalism, trade agreements, corporate influence. As a woman from the Global South, I am glad that the TPP did not proceed, and the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations Plus has been rejected by Fiji, Vanuatu, and Papua New Guinea. Yet, approximately 3,000 bilateral and multilateral trade agreements remain negotiated through the world in secret. This contradicts the promises made by governments under the Agenda 2030. This economic model perpetuates and often relies on systematic discrimination and disadvantage experienced by women who have below subsistence wages through making women's labor invisible and through the use of women's unpaid labor to prop up social protection and the care economy, as what my colleagues have spoken about. Fourth, land and resource threats. Women are losing land, and without land, women are driven to urban centers and into external migration to become cheap labor to power global growth. The acquisition of land by agribusiness or wealthy farmers for large-scale infrastructure, including those under the guise of green growth, routinely results in forced evictions and displacement of communities without respect for their right to free, prior, and informed consent. While significant efforts have been made in my region to reduce emissions and pollutants, as well as to build resilient communities, every day we are living the dire consequences of climate change and the expansion of harmful extractive industries. So in the face of these barriers, how do we achieve Agenda 2030? Perhaps a closer look at means of implementation, and here I pose 2 ideas. First being, are state resources really diminishing? We note that all VNR countries reporting this year offer tax holidays to foreign investors. Foreign corporations often use tax evasive practices. Many countries are failing to collect taxes from corporations and instead increasing regressive taxes. While states express concern on mobilizing $3 to $5 trillion that would be required annually to finance Agenda 2030, between $21 and $32 trillion currently sit undisturbed in offshore tax havens. Why have we not tapped into this? Second, realize that women's rights, feminist movements, and organizations are core MOI. A comprehensive global research spanning over 40 years found that the single most important factor in influencing positive policy change relating to violence against women was the existence of autonomous feminist movements. Their existence was far more significant than the number of women in parliaments, the wealth of a country, the status of treaty ratification, or other conditions tested. Finally, we also hope to see deepened commitment from all governments to CEDAW, Beijing Platform for Action, Cairo Program for Action, and other conventions and commitments as we continue to work towards achieving Agenda 2030, and a deepened commitment to public partnerships between governments and people with women. When women's movements are able to challenge and transform public space and discourse and instigate interventions that advance women's rights, we will be able to achieve Agenda 2030 as well as achieve the goal on gender equality. Thank you.